White helmets stand accused by Syrian civilians and by former white helmets of being involved in organ trafficking and in organ trade, in the abduction of children for the staging of events, in the murder of children in the staging of events, right? All of this is on record. And yet there is still no public inquiry into this organization. Or, as I would say now, no inquiry into the BBC's complicity with this cover up.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. I hope we're not dropping out already. It seems we're having a little bit of struggle with the stream right in the beginning. Not surprising. I have always a great guest on the show joining me yet again today to discuss some really important information. In fact, some leaked information that is getting into a discussion that we've talked about quite a lot, specifically with Vanessa Beeley, who's joining me today, in regard to the white helmets, in regard to James Mesurier or Mesurier, however people want to pronounce it, and as well as a lot of information around Syria, foreign funding of terrorism, and Western state-sponsored terrorism, and things that we've been trying to break open on the show for quite a long time. So we're going to have her walk us through some new information that she came across, and probably open us up to some pretty new important things, as well as the fact that I think this is interesting that I'd like to get her opinion on in regard to the crossover and things in regard to COVID and how that applies to this topic as well. So Vanessa, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
You're welcome. I'm just trying to repair my link to the PowerPoint. Everything crashed at that second as I came on. Typical.
Right. Same with this side as well. I don't think that's by accident.
No, I'm sure the powers that be are keeping an eye on us. Hi, no, it's really good to be back. It's been quite a while since we sat down and chatted, and I just wanted to come on because the recent information leak by the same group, supposedly anonymous, that leaked a load of information previously about UK Foreign Office intelligence operations inside Syria, providing particularly heavy media support for the armed groups, including those affiliated to Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda inside Syria. So effectively supporting terrorism and endorsing and advocating terrorism in Syria, as of course they have done since even before 2011. Then, of course, we had another tranche of documents from the same organization demonstrating that one of the main protagonists or one of the main intelligence contractors in Syria was also being contracted to infiltrate intelligence, security, military institutions in Lebanon, of course, in an attempt to instigate the same sectarian divisions and conflict there, as they have done or attempted to do in Syria. So the crossover is really, really interesting. And what I wanted to do tonight, there's been a recent leak, another leak by the same group, of documents appertaining to this particular organization, ARC Group, which is headed up by a guy called Alistair Harris, that we are extremely suspicious that he is linked to MI6. In fact, there is now, again, quite recently, a very clear link or a very clear connection between himself and MI6 operations inside Syria. And the BBC, the White Helmets, and other institutions or shadow state organizations that have been established inside Syria in order to both work alongside the terrorists, to provide cover for the terrorists, and to criminalize and demonize the Syrian government, the Syrian army, and allies inside Syria. So I wanted to get into this because what I've actually focused on, I mean, I'll be doing a much deeper dive into all the documents because they're vast and the information that they've released up is very important. But it's going to take a lot of time to go through and kind of write up. But tonight I wanted to focus on the BBC's role because you're well aware, because I came on and talked to you about Chloe Hadjimatheou and her Mayday series, which was effectively a whitewash of the White Helmets operations in Syria, and really a sort of a cover up for James Le Mesurier, who died in November 2019 in Istanbul. And interestingly, the British courts have returned a verdict of not sure if it was suicide or not. So the suicide verdict, which of course suited, let's say, everybody in the UK intelligence agencies and in the UK government, has not actually been confirmed by British courts. So that leaves really the verdict fairly open. So I think if we get straight into it, I want to start with a BBC Panorama report that has effectively been memory hold as far as I can see. It's no longer available at their official iPlayer website. That actual program is no longer available for viewing. It's not available on YouTube. There were a number of people that had downloaded it, and when I went to the link, which I'd had previously, they'd been removed from YouTube altogether. Luckily, I had downloaded the program back in 2017 when we knew it was going to be put out, because I predicted that this would be effectively a disconnect from the White Helmets' involvement in war crimes that are being committed by the armed groups inside Syria. And of course it was. It focused entirely on the Free Syrian Police. But also what is interesting, if we go to the next slide, I prepared all these to kind of try and organize my thoughts. The Free Syrian Police, which was covered in this BBC Panorama program under the title of Jihadis You Pay For, and that gives you a clue. Now, basically, this program exposed the Free Syrian Police that are being funded by UK aid money. Effectively, that money is coming from the British public and is then funding, as the BBC Panorama program showed, terrorist groups, including Nur al-Din Zinki, that were responsible for the beheading of the child Abdullah Isa in August 2016. And that effectively what the BBC Panorama program found was that the aid money was being siphoned to jihadis or Islamists inside Syria, including Nusra Front and Nur al-Din Zinki. Now, the extraordinary thing is, and why this is extraordinary will become clear later on, particularly in relation to the documents that have just been released. No mention is made of the White Helmets first and foremost. And if we go down to the third slide, we demonstrate there that the White Helmets actually, the third one, so the one after that. Yeah. So if you look at the image, I guess it's on the right for people watching, you will see the Free Syrian Police operating quite openly with the White Helmets alongside them. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the Free Syrian Police, as we so often see with the White Helmets, operating inside a building that was occupied by Nusra Front, with the Nusra Front flag over the entrance to the building. Now,
real quick, Vanessa, before you go forward, I want to just get some clarification on a couple of things. Because, two reasons. One, a lot of my audience has been very disconnected from a lot of this stuff for a while, and myself included. So one thing I want to ask before we go further into this is that what we're looking at here are the slides. What is I want to differentiate between the discussion of what was the leaked information and the BBC. The Panorama BBC document, the documentary was publicly put out in 2017. Now they're trying to keep that from everybody's view. So what are we looking at right here? Where are these slides coming from?
These slides are coming from social media images that were sent to me at the time, because just prior to the BBC Panorama program, I had done an in-depth investigation into British funded contractors like Adam Smith International that is targeted in the BBC Panorama program, who were effectively funding what were euphemistically called local councils in East Aleppo. I proved through the documentation that I found in East Aleppo, in the local council buildings, once the terrorists had evacuated from the area to Idlib, paperwork connecting Adam Smith International. When I then investigated it, I found that the head of the local council was also the head of the White Helmets, and he was originally an armed member of Tawhid Brigade, which was the first Turkish-backed terrorist brigade that invaded Aleppo in 2012. But he was also, at that point, head of the local Nusra Front group. So effectively, Adam Smith International and the British government, because they were contracting Adam Smith International to effectively manage these so-called local councils, were therefore funding Nusra Front, because the funding was coming in to a Nusra Front leader who was also head of the White Helmet. So, I mean, it's not
Obvious
rocket science
overlap.
to make that connection.
Right.
So the BBC Panorama program came out immediately after that investigation. So we immediately recognized it as a kind of a smoke and mirrors job, like distracting away from the White Helmets criminality.
Which is something they often do by giving you a little, throwing you a bone to make people go, oh, look, they're admitting something we've been talking about. And it's not really the full picture. Limited hangout is what that would be called.
Yeah, exactly. And this is exactly what this proved to be, because they totally targeted Adam Smith International. Now, to give a little bit of background and why this is going to be important as we continue talking, you'll see the connection to the documents that have been released that have confirmed what I suspected and is connected to this BBC Panorama program, right? So Adam Smith International, they've been awarded, I think, according to BBC Panorama, 537 million in aid contracts. Just run that by yourself again. 537 million pounds, right? English pounds. So I don't know how that converts into dollars right away, but it's a large sum, right? To run aid contracts globally, including inside Syria. It's also worth noting that Adam Smith International have funded Bellingcat to the tune of 65,000. Bellingcat, the well-known intelligence-run, NATO-connected disinformation agency, right?
The overlaps are just so very obvious. I mean, that's the thing for those that who are pulling on their memory from things we've talked about a lot in the past. The overlap between the funding of these groups that then work right alongside the groups like Al-Nusra. For those who don't remember, this is an overt terrorist organization. It's amazing. So please continue.
And the really interesting thing, because I looked into Adam Smith International when I was investigating the White Helmet connection, right? And Adam Smith International, in my opinion, are a fall guy for the British government. So when British government funding is exposed to be going into, let's say, fairly shadowy directions, Adam Smith International take the fall. And this is basically, I believe, what happened with this BBC Panorama program. And as I said, this will become very clear as we start to go through the documents and the information that I have, and making the connection, and this is really important, making the connection between Free Syrian Police and the White Helmets. We see them there working together, but the connection is way bigger. And what I want to try and show is the nexus of organizations that are behind all of these agents that are working for foreign powers to destabilize countries. And the interesting thing, of course, what we're also seeing, Corey Morningstar pointed out that Purpose, that was one of the really big billionaire complex companies that was behind the war in Syria, indirectly funding organizations that funded then the White Helmets, etc., and running a lot of the kind of PR campaigns for the extremist groups and terrorist so-called opposition inside Syria, is now running campaigns on behalf of the COVID project. Einsteidl, who was the producer who made the White Helmets movie that won the Oscar in 2016, is also running now promo movies for the whole COVID project. So
I can't tell you how unsurprised I am, but propaganda is going to propaganda, right? That's how that's going to, it doesn't matter where it's going to go.
Exactly. And I think this is why it's really important, because all the techniques that they used and are using in Syria, they're using on us. So, right. You know, what I always say, like, don't ignore Syria because of COVID. What I try to do is to bring them all together, because it's the same hybrid war, the same multi-spectrum war that was waged against these target nations is now being waged against us. So it's very important for us to recognize the organizations and the type of organizations that are being used to do that.
I'll make one quick point, and then we'll get back to your slide so I don't derail us any further. But I think it's really important to see that the people try to, so like, for instance, I make connections between what's happening with COVID to a lot of other things, and people argue, and they may be right, that's me making it come together. You know, it's what I want to at the end of the day, but I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think what you just described is the continuation of the same things we've been seeing, and it's coming together, and it's obvious. So that's just my opinion, but the overlap there is hard to miss between COVID and everything else. But please continue.
Yeah, so basically, if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that the Free Syrian Police are sitting with a commander of the Free Syrian Army. And you'll probably remember that the Free Syrian Army were the only so-called moderates inside Syria. But of course, the fact that they're sitting with Commander al-Qaidi, who had very clear connections to both Robert Ford, who was American ambassador in Syria when the entire kind of so-called uprising happened, and he was kicked out of Syria for basically fomenting the violence and for supporting the death squads, which were effectively the Free Syrian Army. And he has a history of connection to the creation with Negroponte, for example, of death squads, right? And here he is with al-Qaidi. Al-Qaidi is sitting with the Free Syrian Police, and he's also heavily connected, and it's very well documented, his connection to ISIS. So this was very early on in the conflict. So moving on again, and the reason I'm doing this is because I had to kind of organize my own mind, because, as I say, there was just so much information included. Now, at the end of the BBC Panorama program, they actually make the statement that the money of British taxpayers is being spent very poorly. It is unfortunately strengthening extremists and Islamic groups currently in control of the majority of opposition areas. So let's just underline that one, shall we? In 2017, BBC Panorama noted that the majority of so-called opposition areas are under control of Islamist groups, which are being funded by the British government. Okay, that's translation of what is being said there. Jeremy Corbyn to Theresa May also said something very similar. It's the responsibility of our government to ensure robust scrutiny and transparency processes are in place to prevent such grotesque abuses of UK aid money. Now, this is where we come to Chloe Hadjimatthew, who, as I said, produced the Mayday series, which was basically a 15-series program, effectively a smear campaign against all those, including myself, who had exposed the White Helmets and exposed British government intelligence operations inside Syria for some time, including, of course, the White Helmet involvement in the OPCW report, which of course has since been discredited by the dissenting inspectors that were part of the original investigative team. Now, what's important in this, in what we're talking about tonight, of course, I can branch off into 100 different directions, but I'm really trying to focus. And I know you and I struggle with that because we get so carried away with it.
I'm laughing about right now. I have 45 things I want to say right now.
I know, exactly. Even me, I'm trying to kind of, you know. So basically, as part of the Mayday series, Chloe interviewed Alistair Harris. Now, Alistair Harris heads up the ARC group. The ARC group is the subject of the recent document leak. So this is where we're starting to see the connection to the recent document exposure, right? she interviewed Alistair Harris because as CEO of ARC Group, he's connected in 3 ways, probably more, but I'm looking at 3 ways tonight. First of all, the White Helmets, okay? James Mesurier was working for ARC Group when he was tasked, and he headed up the Istanbul office of ARC Group. And again, that was mentioned later in the same article that I've highlighted here by Chloe Hadjimatthew. And he created the White Helmets. But again, in the Mayday series, there is no mention of James Mesurier's connection to the Free Syrian Police, right? So we're seeing here the BBC is managing a very clear disconnect from the Free Police and the White Helmets. They are exposing the Free Police as siphoning British aid money through Adam Smith International to terrorists. Now, it's worth noting, I've mentioned it at the end, but I'll mention it here. This was December 2017. The British government claimed it froze funding. It didn't, because I tracked the funding through the British government documents. It continued funding Adam Smith International. By February 2018, the entire Free Syrian Police project was back on. So we're talking 1 month, right? That the British government went, oh yeah, like, yeah, we shouldn't be funding terrorists. By February 2018, funding was switched back on. So this is why I think this entire operation was to distract away from the White Helmets. Fast forward 2019 to 2020, Chloe Hadjimatthew is brought in to further cover up the role of the White Helmets in the destabilization project run by the UK Foreign Office and intelligence agencies inside Syria.
We see this kind of play with action that's hollow with politics and media all the time. Actually, interestingly enough, we saw it very similarly with Trump's move to defund the White Helmets too, where they make a big splashy statement and everybody covers it, and then 2 days later they go back on it, but nobody covers that part of it. Then it ends up being like,
I actually called out Trump's frozen funding. I actually said no. All it's done is just distract, is deviated it to someone else.
Right.
And to ensure that funding will continue, but not through, the usual auspices. That's basically what that was down to.
Right. Same thing happened with the WHO and Gavi and the same kind of thing, where the Trump supporters were like, oh, he defunded them, and no, they just funneled it through, and they got more now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it's just a wormhole. I mean, they just swap wormholes. It's like shove the money through a different hole in the wall to the first one, and then when everyone's forgotten and the dust has settled down and so on, then they come back to the original Adam Smith International, as I said, been had up for fraud multiple times, very shadowy operation, and yet they continue using it. So what does that tell you about the British government, basically?
Right. After they just admitted that most of the groups are terrorist organizations when it suited them, but now we'll come back and now they're good because we won't talk about it anymore.
Yeah, now they're good because everyone's forgotten about it now, and COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, in this particular article, in the Mayday series, Chloe interviewed Alistair Harris. In a later article, she also interviewed a guy called Shia Mohammed, who turns out to be a very close friend of James Mesurier. And again, this is very interesting because I actually wrote to Chloe and asked her directly. I said, and I also later wrote to her line manager because I got no response from either of them, but they can't claim I haven't contacted them. And I asked why they didn't cover Mesurier's connection to the Free Syrian Police in the Mayday series, and also why she interviewed Shia Mohammed and didn't also ask him about James's connection to the Free Syrian Police. And obviously, there was absolutely no answer. But this is where it gets interesting, okay? Remember, in the BBC Panorama program, there was no mention of the ARC group, right? Analysis, Research, and Knowledge is what it stands for. Basically, Stratcom in another disguise, right? The target was Adam Smith International, that took the fall for 1 month and then came back on stream in February. Why was ARC Group completely covered up, and why is the BBC now memory holing this program? Because in one of the recently released documents, we see very, very clearly, if we skim down, ARC has also provided communications support to other conflict stability and security funds. So that's the UK Foreign Office, very kind of shady fund that has zero transparency, or certainly used to. Many MPs actually complained about it a couple of years ago. So the CSSF funded projects in Syria, such as Syria Civil Defense, which is a complete shadow state fraudulent name because they're the white helmets. Syria Civil Defense exists inside Syria, created in 1953, and the only one recognized by the International Civil Defense Organization in Geneva, and the Free Syria Police, through posters, booklets, broadcast products, receiving extremely positive feedback, which was gathered through large-scale surveys and social media monitoring. So in other words, very similar to the original leak about the UK Foreign Office providing media support for armed groups, etc. Of course, here we have ARC Group not only helping in the creation through James Le Mesurier of the Free Syrian Police, the White Helmets, but then providing communications. In other documents, they talk about providing stringers or appointing stringers inside Syria to provide them with the information they needed for their various evidence collecting operations to further criminalize the Syrian government, etc. And also, what is extraordinary, what comes through from and explains, in my opinion, why they are trying to desperately cover up this operation, is the sheer size of it, Ryan. I mean, this guy, Alistair Harris, who in the Mayday series program sort of rather coyly says, you know, he should be described as a diplomat, you know, who clearly has links to security apparatus, to MI6, you know, etc. And is running intelligence operations in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq. I mean, you know, when years ago, I remember going on James Corbett and talking about why the White Helmets are being so protected. And I said, because I'm guessing it's going to be a global franchise. Well, bang on. I was over target, you know.
I remember you saying that.
Exactly, yeah. That's exactly what these documents now prove, right?
That it was aimed at that from the very beginning. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why the identity or rather the the involvement of ARC has been covered up. Why? Because they are involved in the global franchise of organizations like the Free Syrian Police, like the White Helmets. I mean, they might be rebranded, but effectively it's the same. It's the same thing. I mean, they are now running operations in Tripoli and Lebanon, very similar to the White Helmet operations, right?
Yeah.
And all of this is contained in these documents, by the way.
So it sounds like ARC is the main focal point to really see where this agenda is being played. I do notice that it says Yemen right beneath there. And so, I mean, obviously the Yemen occupation is one of the worst things happening on the planet right now. So it's not surprising to see, oh, look at, they're doing the same thing there. How long until we see White Helmets in Yemen? I think that's already been tried, if I remember correctly, right?
Well, I mean, effectively they are there. But as I say, they're just, I'm actually looking into that at the moment, but they're in the south. And of course, the south originally was a British colony. Aden was under control of the British, right? And Britain has been pushing for the succession or the secessionist movement in the south, in Aden. So it's no real surprise that you might find organizations now there, like the White Helmets, running similar operations. And we know that the White Helmets are effectively, not always very successfully, but running intelligence operations for the British government and allies inside Syria. So that's effectively what they're there to do.
And I would point to your previous work and our interviews on that work in regard to what has been done around or because of the presence of the White Helmets, such as human trafficking, organ trafficking, child trafficking, and all sorts of other things, regime change, false flags. And this is not some hyperbole, right? This is stuff that's been presented at The Hague and otherwhere. It's just being ignored by Western media. And that's what's so alarming to see this reach growing, especially under the growing whatever we're looking at today. Like maybe we can talk about this at the end if you prefer, but maybe what you see this connecting with in that whole apparatus, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if we move on again, so
Mhm.
to the next slide, basically in the same article that Chloe interviews Shia Mohammed, it's mentioned that James Le Mesurier is the head of the Istanbul office of Alistair Harris's organization, ARC. At the time that he created the White Helmets in collaboration with a Turkish first responder organization called AKUT, Akut. But then that's where it kind of gets interesting, because it was actually a friend of mine inside Syria that picked up on this Facebook page of Shia Mohammed, where he's obviously speaking about James after his death in November 2019. And he mentions the fact that he worked with James Le Mesurier to create the White Helmets, the White Helmets and the Free Syrian Police. So again, in the entire Mayday series, as far as I'm aware, I will listen to it again. I asked Chloe to let me know if I was wrong, but she didn't correct me.
Mm-hmm.
There is no mention of James's involvement with the Free Syrian Police, and this becomes very important as we move on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's confirmed. This isn't the only document, the previous one. This isn't the only document relating to ARC's involvement with the Free Syrian Police. There are multiple documents, okay, showing how deep their involvement was in the creation of this organization. So let's just remind everyone, they were not mentioned in the BBC report. They were completely erased from this funding of terrorists through the Free Syrian Police, right? Even though they created them,
right,
and they ran their media operations.
There's no way that's an accident. So I just gotta say that's my opinion. I'm happy to say that. There's no way that was accidental, unless you want to tell yourself that these BBC journalists are the most incompetent people in journalism, maybe a little bit of both. But I think it's obvious that this is a willful omission of something that ties this all together.
Absolutely. And actually, the photo on the left is of James Le Mesurier trying out one of the Free Syrian Police uniforms in East Aleppo. And going back to the BBC Panorama program, one of the accusations that was levied against the Free Syrian Police was the fact that they actually not only enabled money to reach the hands of the terrorist groups, including Nur al-Zinki, but that they participated in torture. They participated in the detainment of civilian prisoners. They participated in various executions, including stoning under Sharia law. They worked with Nur al-Zinki, who, as I said, beheaded the 16-year-old boy, or was he 12? Sorry, 12-year-old boy in East Aleppo in 2016. Have you disappeared?
Oh,
you disappeared for a second. And exactly the same type of accusations are levied, not by the BBC, but by Syrian civilians against the White Helmets. The White Helmets participated in torture and execution. They enabled the detainment of civilian prisoners. They participated in the summary execution under Sharia court law. And James Le Mesurier even admitted that when he was trying to excuse their participation or their mopping up after executions by saying, well, they're operating under Sharia law. Well, James, that's under, extremist Islamic law, mate. So effectively what we're seeing is a mirroring of operations, but the White Helmets were completely pushed to one side and no, they're fine. The Free Syrian Police were exposed, and yet both operations are created and run by the same organization, the same UK government contractor, which is ARC Group, which employed James Le Mesurier to set both organizations up.
Which is why he was omitted. But what you can't, this is what I see all the time in this, and it's willful by the people that don't want to see this, that he points and you, as you said, makes the excuse and says, well, it's because of the Sharia law. But then later down the line, you point back at this, well, he admitted they were, but there's an excuse. Now it's just that didn't happen. That's not the case. Yeah. They never did that, but it's all just narrative in the moment, and this is the frustrating part, is that there's a level of even people involved in this, just discussing media, who choose not to see it. Same thing in every discussion you want to point out today. It's just becoming very obvious. But that's the kind of stuff that I love your work for, is because you're keeping the continuity here. He did say that. So you can't go forward acting like that's not the case.
Exactly. And he also talked in I think it was a Georgetown University paper, he talked about the sectarian nature of the White Helmets, which again is something that I've always labored. You know, they are sectarian, they're not inclusive of all other minority sects inside Syria. So effectively, they're prone to the extremist radicalization. If you're going to sort of give them some get out, if you like, because of their sectarian thinking, they are more likely to be radicalized by the extremist armed groups, particularly Nusra Front. But then again, one of the White Helmets who was still operating when I interviewed him in the southern Syria in Dara told me quite clearly, if a leader of the White Helmets is Nusra Front, the whole group will be Nusra Front. So, you know, they were heavily influenced by the extremist ideology of the armed groups that were affiliated to Nusra Front. Now, in September 2018, and Whitney wrote about this at Mint Press News, the Netherlands actually cut funding to the White Helmets over likely links to terrorism and the likelihood or the lack of assurances that funding was not basically being siphoned to the terrorist groups in a very similar way to the Free Syrian Police. But yet again, no mention from the BBC. And I'm pretty certain that this wasn't really mentioned by Chloe Hadjimatthew in her Mayday series either. And then, of course, in 2020, you had the Volkskrant revelation that James Le Mesurier was basically under suspicion of fraud, having, according to the investigation, embezzled, let's you know, at least 50,000, which had gone to the costs of his wedding to Emma Winberg, then Emma Le Mesurier. And of course, let's round this off completely. Emma Winberg set up a company called IncoStrat with Paul Tilley, another former military contractor. And what did Emma Winberg do? She ran PR and media support for armed groups inside Syria, which included Jaish al-Islam, that occupied Douma, where the chemical attack in 2018 happened. One of the most violent sectarian extremist groups inside Syria, responsible for mass ethnic cleansing, executions, torture in the prison where they kept all the prisoners that they kidnapped from Adra to the north of Damascus, and then took them to Douma, where they kept them in Taba jail, and also put them in cages and used them as human shields in, I think it was November 2015. So Emma Winberg, then later the impact officer at Mayday Rescue, married James Le Mesurier, but formerly in charge of PR for some of the most violent armed groups inside Syria. But again, this was completely and utterly omitted from the Mayday series, from any articles that then followed by Chloe Hadjimatthew. And in fact, Emma Le Mesurier is now apparently going after Volkskrant for their baseless smears against JLM. But of course, there's an awful lot of omission in her claims. I can't go too much into the whole kind of financial front because we'll be here all night. But it's been covered by a number of outlets, independent outlets, including the Working Group for Syria Media and Propaganda, which of course were the academics that were then targeted. I'll come on to that.
Well, real quick, I wanted to ask you in regard to the money and all the other things that you're discussing, the wife and the connections and all. Is there, your email obviously reached out to try to clarify, like, why were these things not included? Is there any level of like, here's why this obvious stuff that's verifiable was not, to just pretend it's not there? That's crazy.
I think they're just kind of going, don't reply.
Yeah. I'm actually, I mean, as much as I know they're all propaganda, I'm actually baffled by how blatant this is today. Cause this is written. I mean, you're pointing to previous mainstream discussions that prove that they're not including this stuff. They're not even trying anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary. And the BBC is the British state media, right? I mean, like it really, I mean, there seriously has to be a public inquiry into this. I mean, John Bilger did the fantastic The War You Don't See after Iraq and held the BBC to account. But I mean, there has to be, not only on Syria and Iraq and Libya and so on, Afghanistan, but also now on COVID. I mean, their coverage has been nothing short of gaslighting, to be honest. And, you know, it's a psyop, and that's what they're running here.
It's revealed what they really are and the purpose they serve from the top down. I guarantee there are people within there, like the Alison Morrows of the world, that are trying to do good within and they just realize they can't and break off. But we should see this today with everything, especially COVID related. It goes back to stuff like this. This is what they're there for. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that the organization that vindicated James Le Mesurier, in other words, kind of completely got him off the hook posthumously of his claims, you know, the claims against him of fraud, and his own admission, actually, was Grant Thornton. Now, when we look at Grant Thornton, again, a little bit like Adam Smith International, we just see an absolute litany of fraud cases against them. So it's not exactly what I mean, I haven't, because I only looked into that today, so I haven't had time to kind of really go deep into it and see if there's a connection with government agencies. I'm pretty sure I can find something if I look hard enough. But I mean, the number, and I've only put 3 or 4 up here, but the sheer number from about 2004 until now of cases of fraud and misrepresentation, and negligence, etc., against Grant Thornton is extraordinary. I haven't seen anything like it. But and here we come again. What I'm trying to show now is the fact that all of these organizations involved, particularly in Syria and under the umbrella of ARC, are responsible for the theft, basically, of public money, the sponsorship of terrorism, effectively, Free Syrian Police, White Helmet Funds, right? And so here in one of these documents, we pick up a connection between ARC and an organization called Active Strategy.
Just real quick to cut in, Vanessa, I apologize. Yeah. I believe I'm a couple slides behind you on there. For the audience, I apologize about that.
Sorry.
I wasn't aware that you just, so I just want to make sure people for the audience can see. No, it's okay. I'm so interested in what you're discussing. I'm losing track of this. So just so people can see for the show, this is what you were referencing in regard to the fraud. And there's all the evidence in front of you, the mainstream articles, so you can see. And then we're caught up with you. Please continue. Work in tandem with another implementer. That was my fault. Please continue.
No worries. I was getting too much into it. So they were basically then requested, so from 2013 to 2015, to work in tandem with another implementer, Active Strategy, that was designated to deliver one of 6 lines of effort. So basically, he then talks about Actis's lack of prior experience on Syria and the fact that ARC will work closely with them to deliver the program. So effectively, ARC took control of the Actis program. Right. Now, the only slight problem with that, now let's remember, Actis was created in 2013. So at the point when the Integrated Community Security Program in Syria, under ARC's supervision, 2013 to 15, right? So let's go forward. So they were established in 2013, but let's go to April 2019. Former UK diplomats, Dr. Andrew Rathmell and Alex Martin, handed millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money for Foreign Office projects, caused huge damage to, of course, Britain's reputation as firms collapsed, leaving hundreds out of jobs. So basically the same thing again. Millions of taxpayers' funds going into Active Strategy, who basically defrauded the British government, but were former British government civil servants, right?
See, this is where I always argue that from a government level, they would always rather be seen as incompetent than criminal. And I argue it's not just that they got defrauded. It's probably just that's the way they cover them willfully funding these operations. What do you think about
and
that?
I mean, this is total privatization of foreign aid, right?
Right.
Because what they're effectively doing is palming it off to private contractors. So when it all goes hideously wrong and the British government is funding terrorism inside Syria, they can wash their hands of it and blame Adam Smith. Or blame, but of course they haven't blamed ARC because ARC is useful for the future. So they're protecting ARC.
It's sort of the public-private partnership of the foreign policy aspect of this is what it feels like. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, so if we move on to the next part on actors. So there you'll basically say the wife of Britain's ambassador in Iraq quit her senior role with Actis because she saw the writing on the wall. Bosses blew a six-figure sum on a champagne field retreat, etc., right? So British taxpayer funds are basically going to former British civil servants who are then squandering it and misusing it. Now, I don't know whether it's worth bringing up at this point that Emma Winberg, certainly a number of journalists have approached her about it and asked her, but I think it was in 2017, she purchased an apartment in Amsterdam, which has recently gone on the market for 1.9 million. So as a lowly CEO of a company providing PR for terrorist groups, one has to ask where on earth they she got the financing for that kind of. And then, of course, as I said, as I mentioned, within 1 month, the project was back on stream, the Free Syrian Police. So in my opinion, as I said, this entire exercise, including the BBC Mayday series, including BBC Panorama, which has now been memory hold, and I would also like to know, has anyone heard of Chloe Hadjimatheou since the Mayday series? But the really interesting point, and this is where I can come on to the fact that when I went to the UK recently, I was detained by the anti-terrorism police for 6 hours on my arrival on the basis under Section 3 of the Anti-Terrorism Act, which is the intent to commit hostile acts. And apparently my hostile act was to provide secret information to foreign intelligence agencies. I mean, of course, my first response to them was, well, why are you interviewing me and not the British government as sponsors of terrorism globally? But the interesting thing towards the end of the interview, and I was held for 6 hours, I had to give DNA, I had to give fingerprints. They downloaded all the information from my phone. I now actually have Julian Assange's lawyers trying to retrieve the information under the Journalist Protection Act, and I'm due to speak to them fairly soon about that. But from the questioning in the interview, right, I would hazard a guess that the BBC was involved in my detention.
That's what
I would also hazard a guess that an organization called the Commission for International Justice and Accountability that carried out a sting operation against an academic member of the working group, which was then fed to the BBC, to Chloe Hadjimatheou, to run a hit piece, right. Was also behind the detention because of the questions that were asked that could only have come from those two areas. So again, here we see the BBC working in lockstep with intelligence agencies to intimidate and to silence challenging voices to the UK Foreign Office operations, particularly in Syria, but also perhaps with the COVID project, etc.
This is where the Chloe specifically comes to mind, because I'm sure the BBC is behind the push here to a larger degree, but our last discussion, I don't remember if it was actually our last discussion, but the one we had specifically around Mayday and Chloe and the hit piece on you, that was the focal point of literally calling you a terrorist. Like saying that what you're doing, and that's exactly what they picked up on. They used that allegation to detain you, to threaten you, and all of it's based on subjective claims with nothing to back them up, and that's enough apparently That's alarming. And again, I'm glad you bring up something like Assange, because this is exactly what this builds toward, to where there's no accountability, and any journalist that's challenging power will get put into a hole for 6 hours, maybe for the rest of their lives. And that's something they want us all to know without saying it.
Yeah, and also it's worth pointing out that CIJA, the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which is headed up by a guy called Bill Wiley, who was involved in the Saddam Hussein trial in Iraq, was also created by, guess which group, under the control of Alistair Harris. Yeah, you've got it, the ARC group, right? And CIJA, of course, is responsible, and one of the reasons that they lashed out against the working group was they claimed that it would put under threat the 700,000 pages of Syrian government documentation that they claim to have stored in a secure area in the UK. But it has to be pointed out that they have never, ever brought these documents to light, that they have never brought a solid case against the Syrian government, against the Syrian president. So one has to wonder, as to the veracity of these claims that they're making. Right. I mean, 700,000 pages of documentation is a huge archive. But of course, as I said, they come under the auspices of ARC. ARC is known to be running media operations for terrorist groups inside Syria. It headed up the Free Syrian Police that was exposed by BBC Panorama to be funneling money to the terrorist groups and working hand in hand with the terrorist groups, as were the White Helmets, also created by the ARC group and James Le Mesurier. And yet, as I said, they're kept completely protected by the BBC and by, of course, all other associated media, and that includes The Guardian, The Times, that was actually tasked by James Le Mesurier to go on the attack against those that were exposing him, right? That, again, is documented.
And this is why we discuss the BBC and other groups. I mean, this is complicit. This isn't just malfeasance, or I guess, just, lacking integrity. This is an actual action. That, I mean, what they're doing is not just by omission, but in fact, like you're saying, taking out hit pieces, complete propaganda to cover actions. But at the very least, like we're seeing here, a lie by omission is just as complicit, and they're keeping this stuff from people's view. You can go back long before the discussion of the OPCW and that big focal point which is very important, of the lie and the cover up of that whole thing. But to the point you were just making, you can go back long before that, back to Carla Del Ponte and different people from before that very clearly lay out the evidence that this is not what they said it was. And we just keep going forward. So I always find it very interesting that the OPCW part of this seems to be such a focal point, seeing as how there's so many other cases before it that there wasn't an OPCW up in the air discussion. We can prove, we can see. She comes on record and says, no, it was the rebels. We just pretend that's not there. I often wonder whether these are false kind of arguments to get us focused on the wrong part of the conversation,
Yeah, absolutely. And also, don't forget that BBC Panorama was implicated in a possible hoax incendiary bomb attack in 2013, just before Britain voted on whether they should intervene militarily in Syria and bomb Syria effectively. And of course, that was exposed by researcher Robert Stewart. So BBC Panorama also is implicated as a separate entity or as a part of the BBC entity, but a kind of, a branch of it, which is implicated in 2013. And now, in my opinion, implicated in 2017. This was a total cover up. Let's throw Adam Smith International into the mix. Let's throw Free Syrian Police to the dogs, but we'll bring them back in when everything's died down.
Right.
And that's basically what that was all about. And that is clearly demonstrated now by the most recent leaks, which totally expose Le Mesurier's involvement in the Free Syrian Police, not mentioned, and ARC's involvement in the creation of the Free Syrian Police, and their involvement, as I said, globally on behalf of the British government to gain influence and to foment destabilization in target countries, which include Lebanon, include Yemen, Iraq, etc.
Yeah, I think it's such an obvious, just whether or not you hear all this and you walk away thinking, well, they're just being dishonest, or there's more to it. There's more, willful action in regard to foreign policy taking place from BBC level. it's obvious that this is just dishonest journalism. There's so much being missed in this conversation, willfully so. And that's just, and that's the smallest part of it. So we really need to stand back and look at the bigger picture here of what this is leading to and what's being covered up. Go ahead, you had a point.
No, but I mean, you also have, as we've pointed out, the OPCW scandal, but you've also had, I mean, for example, we've had the Oxfam Sex for Food scandal. You've had Red Cross. You've had what is it? The International Rescue Committee, the refugee organization run by David Miliband. All of them accused and investigated for sexual deviancy, right? The White Helmets stand accused by Syrian civilians and by former White Helmets of being involved in organ trafficking and in organ trade, in the abduction of children for the staging of events, in the murder of children in the staging of events, right? All of this is on record. And yet there is still no public inquiry into this organization, or, as I would say now, no inquiry into the BBC's complicity with this cover-up. Not even complicity. I mean, they're running the cover-up, right, from the evidence that I've put out there tonight. They're running it.
I agree with that. And that's we shouldn't be afraid of making such claims when the evidence is obvious. People are so afraid to make contentious claims these days when, it's right on the table. It's obvious. Either they're the most incompetent news organization in history, or they're very clearly covering something up that's right in front of us. Because that's the point, to go back to what I said before. Let's be very clear that when Vanessa is pointing to BBC articles, and in that article, it says something that they're currently saying isn't true. Yeah. So they're wrong one of the times, right? I mean, it's just it's insulting to your intelligence. But let's bring this over into the current part, because I got so many things right now that make you the one that stands out to me the most. And we could probably talk for the next 3 hours about why this could overlap. But so you have this very clear history of chemical weapons, biological threats mixed in there as well, in regard to the White Helmets, the involvement, the cover up, or their narrative just being there to help. And now you see this interesting crossover today with all of that, where obviously we're talking about viruses and that kind of pandemics, but they've also tried to make that connection to, well, what about anthrax? What about smallpox? Like the weaponization of this. And you can see how this could connect to a foreign policy level. And then it brings me to the conversation of White Helmets, a global apparatus or a global organization being deployed to do what, essentially, and how that may overlap and be used in a context of COVID-19. I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Well, that's interesting. You've just jogged my memory. I think it was, might have been 2019. I was contacted by someone, and I can't give out names because it was on the basis of anonymity, that wanted me to provide as much information as possible to discredit the White Helmets, because they were really concerned that they tendered for an international contract with a very high level international organization running first responders globally, right? And luckily, I don't think it was only down to my information, but luckily, a number of the board members on the organization were against the idea because of the White Helmet reputation. And the whole idea was not pushed through successfully, thank goodness. So that was derailed.
What year was this?
Go on.
What year was that? That's what I was asking, the year?
I think that would have been I think it was 2019, so the year before 2020.
That's right? See, that just all the red flags stand up right there. I mean, that's
really, and I mean, you just jogged my memory at that point, because I'd memory hold that, because I hadn't put huge, although I'd registered it, I hadn't connected it to anything. But now you've mentioned it, I've kind of rewound back to that point and thought, okay, that does make sense. But it's also, there's no reason to think that ARC, for example, is not going. I mean, it's running Stratcom for strategic communications for just about every terrorist group on the planet, So if the COVID operation or the COVID project or whatever bioterror, cyber warfare project is going to take precedence over localized conflict, right, It's very possible that that is one reason that ARC is being protected, because it has a role in that environment also. And it could also be, as you said, the militarization of medical, I don't know what you would call it, medical groups, medical organizations, right? In order to push through the health tyranny that they're trying to get through now. It could well be that that is militarized at some point, in which case I would expect to see an organization like ARC getting involved. Because
we're already doing that to a degree around the world.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I haven't gone through all the documents. I know Kit Clarenberg recently wrote an article published up at Grey Zone about the crossover with the Syria propaganda, etc. So yeah, there is clear connections. And I think when you look at the extent of the operations that are running globally on behalf of the British government, it's extraordinary. And I mean, the resources that are being poured into this organization in order to be able to run these, what are effectively intelligence surveillance operations. I mean, they've totally infiltrated security apparatus in Lebanon, government institutions, intelligence institutions, right? And so they're, and this is, if you like, this is what the British are really good at. So any project, let's say any of the oligarchs that are running the COVID project were probably involved in the Syria project, were probably involved in the Libya project, the Afghanistan project, etc. So
it's all one and the same.
They're going to avail themselves of organizations like Purpose, like ARC, to run the same operations for them on all the different levels. And that's the thing now, is we're having to view the world on so many different from so many different optics, from the localized conflict optic, whether it's Ukraine, China, Russia, Syria, but then on that oligarch level, which is, in my opinion, above the localized conflict level, but it's still weaponizing the local conflict level, right? Because that's still very successful as a depopulation project.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I definitely think that it's one and the same. As I said, I feel like, as I've said many times, it's just this is the inevitable part 2 of the original security state, 9/11, rolling into the biosecurity state. Well, now the technology is where they think they need it to be. Maybe they overshot what they thought they had, but at the end of the day, right now, I definitely see it coming together, and it really alarms me to see how that could be applied, whether you're thinking the false flag aspect or whatever else, and as well, we shouldn't just expect to see, US white helmets with helmets and pads on. It won't be like that. It'll be much more immersed and different, and it might already be happening, and it does. I think we should probably even put a pin in that and revisit this in a couple of months and see, because I think you really hit on something important here. So let me ask you this to finish up this part of it. If that was going to go that direction, I just want your hypothetical opinion. How do you see that playing out? Like what would the transition from a wartime rescue entity and being folded into some sort of a COVID? I would see like the biological connection there, but what are your thoughts on how that might unfold going forward? It's a guess.
Judging by their expertise, like picking up sarin samples with sandals on in country, and they're going to have to kind of up their game a little bit if they're going to be used in the. But of course, what you've seen in Idlib, I mean, that again is interesting. You've seen the new images of white helmets and full hazmat suits, producing PPE. And of course, the funding for the white helmets has now been transformed into funding for the white helmets to produce PPE in Idlib for the millions of COVID patients there, of course, because the boom in COVID numbers is in the northwest in Idlib. And so you're seeing the white helmets now being, transformed into COVID first responders. So it's very possible that will be repeated. It's possible that if there's a bioterror attack, there will be an organization created which will be a first responder within that. I mean, it's relatively easy to see. I mean, for God's sake, they can rebrand. They can rebrand Al Qaeda. You know, how many times in Syria? I mean,
Right.
people have lost count now of who Al Qaeda is and who it isn't, and who the affiliates are, and so on and so forth. They're all the same,
Right.
right? It's just like one big mafia complex, and they splinter into different groups. That's all it is. But
Mm-hmm.
they love this rebranding, the same that they're doing now with COVID, of course.
Right.
You know, from Omicron to Fluorona or whatever it was, and it's, you know, it's just. And that's the thing. People need to see the patterns because they're there.
Right.
And that's why maybe talking about Syria tonight, I'm sure people in the beginning were like, oh my God, he's not talking about COVID. What are we going to do? You know, Syria, where's Syria?
No, don't worry. That's coming up next. That's coming up next. But yeah, I think it's so incredibly important to see that overlap. I mean, for me, I think if I had to put a pin on it, I think it's obvious to see the bio, as you discussed, like, so all of a sudden now it's more first responders to, like, I'm actually really surprised that we haven't seen the hype of a potential weaponized version of what this is, or so on, you know, even though it's probably what we're literally dealing with. It's interesting to see that hasn't happened, like from an Israeli, like, oh, the Iranians are weaponizing what's happening. You know, you can see that easily being lobbed out there with nothing to back it up. So maybe there's a reason that's being weighted on, you know, and then all of a sudden there's an apparatus to have some group to deal with this level of it. And then nothing, I mean, we're already at a point where a new hypothetical variant, then nothing means anything anymore. Is it the symptoms? Is it this? Is it that? And everyone's up in the air. I see that where it might be going, where then all of a sudden, is it COVID? Is it a weapon? And nobody knows. And is it the vaccine side effects? I mean, it gets into a really opaque situation even more than we have now. But I'm glad we had this conversation because it's so very important to not lose sight of what's happening to these Palestine, Syria, Bolivia, on and on and on, Yemen, Venezuela, because it's obvious that people, myself included, have lost a little bit of the focus because of how big this thing is that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And even me, you know, it's crazy. I'm here in Syria, and I've actually never been happier to get back here than I did after my so-called detention in the UK. I've never been happier when a plane's doors closed and I knew it was going to take off safely. But you know, I think I think what is really I've totally forgotten what I was going to say then.
No worries. I do it all the time.
It's not to it's not to lose that focus, and it is really easy to do, but you know, it's all interconnected.
Right.
That's the thing, and I think that's what because, you know, now here in Syria, actually, vaccines are becoming mandatory. I mean, people are being coerced into vaccines here, whereas up until very recently, Syria was quite even-handed and rational in its response to, you know, the so-called pandemic. Now it becomes very clear that some kind of political pressure has been brought to bear, and Syria is having to come a little more into line, let's say.
And if you make this question in general, the larger coordination between governments in general, you know, because this is the same thing we're seeing around the world with countries that you might not have thought, you know, at the very least leaning into a mandate of some sort or a passport. So, yeah, and it could, as you said, it could really just be massive political pressure, financial, IMF pressure. But at the end of the day, it goes in that direction. Any country that's going along with that, any government, it makes me worried and skeptical.
I tend not to see it as the government's making the decisions. I tend to see it as pressure being, whether I'm right or wrong, but how I perceive it is that pressure is being brought to bear by, let's say, the powers that be behind the governments. Because I think what we've seen since the beginning of COVID is a lot of confusion in the messages being put out by governments, right? Until they're all brought into line, and then suddenly they're all saying the same thing pretty much. And then you're like, how did we go from that to that?
Right.
You know, and so it becomes very apparent that they're not fully in control of their policies. Okay, some of them might be enjoying it more than others. But, you know, we know, like, for example, in Africa, the number of leaders that have been either deposed or suddenly dropped dead or been assassinated because they were against the whole health tyranny, global health tyranny project, right? So I think we are going to see, I don't honestly think there's going to be a government in the world in the end that's going to be able to stand against it. And that's, you know, that's where it's up to us, really.
Exactly. Exactly. It speaks volumes to the larger agenda that's at play here. And just
Yeah.
about, we need to be skeptical, open-minded. I mean, I do believe that there are people, even within different higher level locations, that are not okay with what seems to be happening. But sadly, it doesn't feel like, or even obviously it's not the majority. But I do believe that the people, the individual on the ground, the countries, whether just the United States or the world, are very clearly in the majority that they are not okay with where this is all going. Now, that doesn't mean from within that there aren't people that disagree on you should take it or you should wear a mask. But at the end of the day, sort of like how we had, with foreign policy, the same concept. I mean, I can't stop seeing the overlaps because you're right. This is a larger agenda. They're just going into the larger part of it. But that we just need to see that we are all we're not okay with the removal of our rights, the suppression of our movement based on a hypothetical, based on whatever they say is happening, and it's exactly what we've been seeing happen to the Palestinians, to the Yemeni people for this whole time. So we just need to be, like I've been saying this whole time, as Whitney said, your body's the new battlefield, right? We are now the ones under sanctions. It's been inevitable, and now we're here.
Yeah. And also minds, because I mean, basically, this is an entire they've gone from infanticide to infantilization. So we're being reduced to children where we can't decide if we're ill. We need a test to tell us we have symptoms. I mean, it's absolutely insane. And I mean, the thing is, when I went to the UK, I didn't quarantine. I didn't do my PCR test on the second day to make sure I didn't have Omicron or whatever it is, right? I get a text message from the NHS, have you done that you should do? I blocked it and reported it as spam. I was like, for goodness sake. I mean, this is the whole point. We're being reduced down to infants, like dependent upon the state to tell us if we're ill. Like, we don't know we're ill.
Right. Yeah. What's the classic that, a virus so dangerous, you got to be tested to know you have it. It's to end on a positive note, though, I do believe that the reason that's happening is because we are reaching people, right? Your message, my message, it's getting through to people. And so it's the cornered animal analogy, right? It's becoming a little bit over the top because they're desperate to stop this. And I don't think it's working.
Yeah, and I think that's an important crossover as well, because I've made the point the BBC should be held accountable because effectively it has been enabling terrorism inside Syria and then covering up the crimes committed by those terrorists, right? Now, in the same way, the BBC will be weaponized as regards COVID, so it should be held accountable. It's time for us to start holding those in power accountable. The media is never going to do it because the media is part of the same apparatus, right? It's a weapon in the hands of those in power. So it's up to us to hold them accountable, and we have that right, and we have to do it because our future depends upon it. But as regards the BBC, there has to be. What we should be campaigning for is a public inquiry. They should be held accountable. All of these media organizations, right, that have effectively promoted war for decades, that have defended terrorism since 9/11,
right?
They should be held accountable. And that's the bottom line. We've got to fight for our minds. We've got to fight for our bodily autonomy. And all those fake left journalists that are attacking us for our individualism, they weren't saying that when Israel was forcing sterilizing vaccinations on Ethiopian immigrants in the Zionist entity enclaves, right? So suddenly bodily autonomy is bad, then right, it's extraordinary.
It's hypocritical.
It's hypocritical. It's utterly ridiculous. This whole individualism argument stinks to high heaven, and one has to wonder, who's pulling their strings now. I mean, like Chomsky saying that the unvaccinated should be segregated and starved, basically.
Incredible. I mean, it breaks my heart to see stuff like that. Not even because I haven't had things I disagreed with him on, but to have someone have such a staunchly anti-imperialist stance who literally starts screaming about totalitarianism, but they don't realize what they're doing. That's the sad part. Or maybe they do, and they've always been liars. I mean, it's hard to tell, but I don't believe that. I just think that at this point, these are people that are scared. They've been manipulated, and they've pinpointed the idea of health as the way to get that, to reach people like that. They know that health is the way in there. The parasite stress theory and different discussions throughout history have shown that a threat of a health scare breaks down people's logic. I mean, it's very simple, and that's what we saw happen.
And it's really, it's really the whole mass psychosis. It's more of a mass hypnosis. But really, the media is instrumental in that and must be held accountable. It must be, it's got to be taken and held to account. It can't keep getting away with this, because it is such a destructive element in the world we live in.
Yeah. If not the most, I mean, without this, I would argue that this wouldn't be happening or wouldn't be possible.
Exactly.
Social media,
the war in Syria wouldn't be happening without it. COVID wouldn't be happening without it.
Right. I agree completely. But again, recognize that I think the only reason these things are happening is because, for whatever reason, whether a shifting in the planetary alignment or whatever else, people are waking up. People are seeing through the larger agenda, and I think that's why this is happening. So keep pushing, keep doing what you're doing, and I actually really do want to make a point to circle back and talk about that discussion if and when we see something pop up around that. So thank you for being here as always. I always love talking with you, Vanessa. Anything else you want to leave us with?
No, that's it. Right. We did pretty well, actually. We managed to do it in an hour and 20 minutes, which is pretty good for us.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Vanessa. And as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.